This lesson is attachments. We're looking at learning theory today, and it's paper 1 with memory, social and psychopathology. First activity is a little recap activity, so we want you to recap the last lesson, which was animal studies of attachment, by doing the little activities. So 4 keywords, 3 definitions from the lesson, 2 key studies. You can outline them briefly or draw a picture that helps you remember the study, and 1 evaluation point from either piece of research or both of them together. When you've done that, go back through your notes from the lesson, tick off what you got right, anything that you struggled with. So if you struggled with the definition part, have a look at a glossary for definitions. If you struggled with recalling one of the studies or you got the studies muddled up, try and do a little key study sheet for that, or a revision flashcard to help you remember that study. If you struggled with the evaluation points, redo those as a flashcard. One thing that I think people forget to do is to revise evaluation points. The evaluation points are equally as important as the key knowledge and the key studies, so really make sure that you revise those evaluation points as well. So today's lesson, we're looking at learning theory. So what I want us to just think about is what makes you who you are and how much of your behaviour has been learned. So if you think about you yourself, who you are as a person, how much of that have you learned, how have you learnt that behaviour? If you think of an infant, how do they learn their behaviour? Where does that behaviour come from? Okay? And these are topics that will, like questions that we come back to throughout a lot of psychology. So is it nature, is it nurture, and how do we learn different things? Do we learn it from our environment? Do we learn it from our attachments? All of this kind of stuff. So just a couple of questions for you to kind of get thinking. So in the lesson today, we're going to look at learning theory. You can see at the bottom we've got 2 parts to learning theory: classical conditioning, operant conditioning. You might have guessed that was the topic from the keywords that are on the PowerPoint. So learning theory proposes that all behaviour, including attachment, is learnt rather than inborn. So we learn how to behave, we learn how to form attachments as well. We don't just automatically form an attachment, it's something that we learn. So we'll start off with classical conditioning. So a few questions again to get you thinking, see what you can remember about classical conditioning, what keywords at the bottom relate to classical conditioning, something for you to think about. Specifically with classical conditioning now, what we're going to look at is infant and caregivers. So previously you will have learned about Pavlov and classical conditioning. In this topic you don't want to be mentioning Pavlov at all. So if you get a conditioning question or a learning theory question and it's in the attachment topic in the exam, you won't get any marks for talking about Pavlov. You need to focus on the content of this lesson. So what activities do caregivers perform for infants? Have a little think, maybe write a little list. How do infants feel when they experience these activities? So for each activity, next to it, put a little feeling that is associated with that. And why do infants form attachments with their caregivers? Why is that important? So an example of something that I might have on my list is an activity could be providing food or feeding the infant. When a feeling associated that would be pleasure or happiness, or they might feel full and they might feel content when they've been fed. And if you think about that as an activity and a feeling, we could say that an infant forms an attachment with a caregiver because they get food and it makes them feel better, and the caregiver is the one that provides them with food. So if they don't make an attachment with the caregiver, then they're not going to get the food, so they need to form that attachment with the caregiver. So I'll go into classical conditioning in a bit more detail here. So an infant forms an attachment to their caregiver through classical conditioning. When an infant is given food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, they feel pleasure, which is an unconditioned response. The caregiver is a neutral stimulus and they're the one who provides the food. So eventually, with several pairings, that caregiver will be associated with the food, and therefore when the infant sees the caregiver, who becomes the conditioned stimulus, they will experience pleasure, which is a conditioned response. Sorry, there's a few spelling mistakes on there, I apologise. To sum that up, I've got a diagram. I've got a diagram later on. What I'd like you to do is try and sum that up with a diagram. So make sure you've got that information down. And then here we have like an equation diagram. So your keywords are caregiver, pleasure and food. This is the equation itself. So I want you to try and put those words underneath the parts of that diagram. If you want, you can draw it out. So you can draw a picture of a caregiver, a picture of a baby feeling happy, a picture of a baby bottle, and you can insert the images there, because that might help you remember it better with images instead of words. So have a little go at that activity. Spend a few minutes on that. Look back through your notes, try and organise them. And then I've got your answer. So the unconditioned stimulus is food, the unconditioned response is pleasure. The neutral stimulus is the caregiver, which is paired with the food and therefore gives pleasure. The neutral stimulus, which is the caregiver, becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus, which is the caregiver, gives the conditioned response, which is pleasure. Okay? I find it easier to remember it as an equation than as a paragraph. It's up to you which one you revise. As long as you can recite it in the exam, whether you draw it down like an equation or whether you write it out as sentences, it doesn't matter, as long as you get the correct bits in the right place. Okay? So, to recap classical conditioning, it's an association that happens between the caregiver and the food. The caregiver is the neutral stimulus, the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and pleasure is the unconditioned response. Eventually, the caregiver becomes a conditioned stimulus, and when the infant is around that caregiver, they experience pleasure, which is a conditioned response. So that's our classical conditioning. Now we're going to look at operant conditioning. So operant conditioning, there's two parts to this. This is the first part. So this is learning through reinforcement. Again, like I just mentioned with regards to classical conditioning, with operant conditioning you've previously learnt Skinner. When you get an operant conditioning question in attachment, you don't want to be talking about Skinner because you won't get any marks for that. You just need to focus on these ideas on the next couple of slides. So operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement. Babies receive comfort when they cry because they get fed. That's just one example. There's lots of other reasons why they could receive comfort or ways in which they can receive comfort, but I'll focus on food. When the caregiver responds to this and they give the infant comfort, they positively reinforce that behaviour. So now a baby knows that if it cries, it's going to get comfort. Therefore, the baby continues to cry, which gets the attention of the caregiver, and then the caregiver will give them comfort. That doesn't seem like it's going to form an attachment, but because when the caregiver gives that comfort to the baby stops crying, that negatively reinforces it for the caregiver. So the caregiver feels better when they stop the baby from crying. So that means that there's this physical thing that a caregiver needs to do for an infant to stop them crying, and therefore they are around them more, and this helps develop an attachment. So that's the first part of operant conditioning, or the first theory of operant conditioning. There's another theory of operant conditioning which is to do with drive reduction. And this was developed by Dollard and Miller. So they explained it in a different way. They said that when infants are hungry, they feel discomfort, and therefore they want to receive food. And receiving food, like hunger, is a drive for an infant, okay? And it drives them to remove that discomfort. And when that discomfort is removed, it reduces that drive, okay? So they would say that infants form an attachment because they have this drive, which is hunger, and they want to reduce that drive, so they seek somebody who can help them reduce that drive. So it's explained in the following stages. So the infant experiences hunger, they therefore attract attention, then they receive comfort, which is the food, which is a primary reinforcer, and then the caregiver is the person who gives them that food, therefore they're a secondary reinforcer. So the infant wants to be around the caregiver because they know that that caregiver can help them reduce that drive, that hunger. So that's why they want to be around the caregiver. I always tend to joke this is probably why you still really like your mum or your caregiver, because they give you food when you're hungry. So that's like the main link there. So that's a little bit of a different explanation. Both of these are mentioned in all of the textbooks, so you can either remember both of them or just one, it's up to you. If you get a 16-mark question, you can talk about classical and operant conditioning, if it's based on learning theory as a whole. So yeah, it's up to you if you remember both parts of the operant conditioning or you just focus on one. If you're just going to focus on one, I personally prefer drive reduction theory to the other theory, but the other theory might be a little bit easier for you to remember, but the drive reduction theory's got a little bit more weight to it, I think. There's a little bit more that you can explain with drive theory, and you can mention a psychologist as well, which sometimes kind of helps show you have good knowledge and understanding. So just to recap operant conditioning, it's to do with reinforcement. This can be positive or negative. It's all linked to the idea of receiving comfort, which often comes through food, and a lot of the explanations for operant conditioning and classical conditioning are based on this idea of food being really important. You have two parts to this. You have the idea that a baby cries to receive comfort, and then when they receive comfort, that's positive reinforcement for the crying. The caregiver gives them the food, therefore this is, and they stop crying, which is a negative reinforcement for the caregiver to give the food or the comfort to that infant. Then you've got the drive reduction theory, which is a little bit different, and this is the idea that the infant has a drive, which is hunger, then they're driven to reduce that drive through attracting attention, and then that drive is reduced by food, which is a primary reinforcer, and then that primary reinforcer is provided by the caregiver, who becomes a secondary reinforcer, and this is how an attachment forms. So now we've got some evaluation points. So attachment is a very complex behaviour. So the idea of attachment and learning theory is a very simple explanation of attachment. You can link it to the idea of, I put issue, but it could be a debate. It's more of a debate of reductionism. It comes in your issue or debate topic. So it's the idea that it's too simplified, it doesn't take into account lots of other factors. And then we've got two pieces of opposing research. We've got Harlow and Schaefer and Emerson. So Harlow actually goes against a lot of learning theory, because learning theory is based on food being the main source of comfort, when actually you don't necessarily need food, because the monkey spent more time with the comfort wire monkey than the one that provided food. And for the monkeys, the comfort, it didn't matter what form it was in, it wasn't necessarily food was more important. Then Schaefer and Emerson also found that infants had attachments to people who didn't perform caregiving activities. So people who didn't feed them, they actually had attachments to them. So this doesn't explain why we would form attachments to individuals who aren't our main source of food or caregiving activities. So operant conditioning isn't necessarily used by psychologists as much anymore, because it only explains a limited number of behaviours. It also sees the infant as being quite passive in terms of attachment, when actually, when we think about it, like interactional synchrony and reciprocity, the infant's more active according to those theories, so that kind of goes against it. Also doesn't explain how secondary reinforcers work, because they don't directly reduce the discomfort, because it's the food, not the secondary reinforcer necessarily, that always reduces the discomfort. So why are they connected in that way? So overall thing to remember with evaluation is that it's too simple. There's opposing research from Harlow and Schaefer and Emerson. Okay, it doesn't really explain everything in enough detail, and these studies go against it. Now I've got an exam practice question for you to have a go at. So it's 6 marks. It should take you about 8 minutes. Make sure you read the item, make sure you use the item in your answer. So have a go at that. So here's our mark scheme. So you've got to make sure that you link it directly to Max and his mother, because if you don't link it to Max and his mother, then you can only get 3 marks. So it's really important that you link it to Max and his mother. And you can see that bottom point there, unrelated descriptions of classical or operant conditioning are not credit worthy. So if you've mentioned Pavlov or Skinner, you don't get any marks for that because it's not relevant to this topic of attachment. So learning theory, you've got classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, food is the unconditioned stimulus, pleasure the unconditioned response. Max's mother was associated with the food, so becomes the conditioned stimulus. That's why an attachment forms between Max and his mother. Operant conditioning, Max feels hungry, and when he gets food it makes him feel comfortable again, so this focuses on drive reduction. Food was a primary reinforcer, his mother became a secondary reinforcer. Okay? So I guess that's another reason why I like drive reduction, because it's been used in a mark scheme before. So it is a good one to use with regards to operant conditioning. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. Make sure you make some revision notes for this. If you struggled with the equation idea, maybe practice a few of those. Have a look back at the exam questions which are on Google Classroom. Try and find some from this topic and have a go at them. And complete the weekly quiz when you're done. Thank you.